started with a scream, a man running for his life down a quiet London street, a car speeding after him like a predator refusing to lose its prey. Witnesses watched in paralyzed disbelief as the vehicle screeched to a violent stop. Two men stepped out, and one of them held something no one expected to see in broad daylight – a sword. Within moments, the ordinary afternoon dissolved into terror. Drivers thought they were witnessing an attempted rescue until they looked closer. The men weren't helping the victim, they were attacking him, repeatedly, brutally. One witness said they literally swung at the other guy's head. Another described a scene so shocking he questioned whether it was real. The victim, wearing a Help for Heroes shirt, dragged, stabbed, and butchered in the middle of the road as one of the attackers calmly held a gun. This wasn't just violence. This was terror, unfolding in real time. This is the story of the gruesome murder of an American soldier by two black men. Here's what makes this case different from any terrorist attack you've heard about. The killers didn't just commit murder and flee into the shadows. They stayed at the scene for 14 minutes. They spoke to bystanders. They posed for cameras. They waited for police to arrive so they could charge at armed officers, forcing them to shoot. And one of those bystanders, a 48-year-old mother of two on her way home from visiting her son, walked right up to a man holding a bloodied cleaver and asked him to hand over his weapons. Her name was Ingrid Loyal Kennett, and what she did that day, what she said to these killers as they stood covered in an innocent man's blood, reveals something profound about courage, about evil, and about how ordinary people respond when evil walks among them in broad daylight. What you're about to hear isn't just a true crime story. It's an examination of radicalization, of missed opportunities, of a security apparatus that knew about these men but couldn't stop them. It's about a 2-year-old boy who would grow up without his father. It's about eyewitnesses who can never unsee what they saw. And it's about 13 minutes of footage that was broadcast around the world, turning a murder into a media event that the killers orchestrated from start to finish. This is the story of the Woolwich attack, and by the end, you'll understand why this case changed how we think about lone wolf terrorism, why it exposed cracks in our intelligence systems, and why the face of one of these killers, standing in that street with blood on his hands, became the image that defined homegrown terror in Britain. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now with your first reaction to what I just told you. Does it shock you that bystanders engaged with the killers? Do you think you would have done the same? Because this case is going to challenge everything you think you know about how people react under extreme pressure. I release investigations like this every week, diving deep into cases that deserve this level of detail. Next week, I'm covering a case that makes this one look simple by comparison. A murder that was hiding in plain sight for 17 years until one detective refused to let it go. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and let's get into this. Now, to understand what happened on May 22, 2013, we need to go back to when Lee Rigby was just a boy growing up in Crumpsall, Manchester, dreaming of being a soldier. Back to when Michael Adebolojo and Michael Adebowale were just names in security files, young men on the fringes of extremist groups, radicalizing slowly, quietly, until they weren't on the fringes anymore. Lee James Rigby was born in July 1987. Friends called him Riggers. He was the kind of kid who lit up a room, always joking, always looking after his younger sisters. His family described him as larger than life. All he ever wanted from the time he was small was to wear the uniform. At 18, he enlisted. He joined the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers and became a drummer, a machine gunner, a soldier who served in Cyprus, Germany, and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, he worked as a fire support group at Patrol Base Wokob in Helmand Province. He came home in 2010 and took up a recruiting position in London, working at the Tower of London while living at the Woolwich barracks. He married Rebecca, his childhood sweetheart. They had a son, Jack. By 2013, their marriage had ended, but Lee remained a devoted father to his 2-year-old boy. Jack would wear a T-shirt to his father's funeral that read, "My daddy, my hero." He was too young to understand what had been taken from him, but he'd grow up knowing. On the morning of May 22, 2013, Lee finished his shift at the recruiting office. He was wearing civilian clothes, a Help for Heroes hoodie, jeans, nothing that marked him as military except to someone who was looking. He took the train to Wellington Arsenal Station, arriving at 2:10 in the afternoon. He walked down Wellington Street, heading toward the barracks. He had no idea that 2 men had been waiting for him. 2 men who'd been watching soldiers come and go from that barracks for days, planning, waiting for the right moment.
Michael Adebolajo was 28 years old. Born in December 1984 to a Nigerian Christian family in Lambeth, he seemed, on the surface, like a success story. He attended university, studied sociology at the University of Greenwich, but something changed. Around 2003, he converted to Islam. Not long after, he became involved with Al-Muhajirun, a radical Islamist group that had been banned in the UK. He attended protests, grew more extreme. In 2010, he traveled to Kenya with plans to join al-Shabaab, the al-Qaeda-affiliated militant group in Somalia. Kenyan authorities arrested him before he could cross the border. He later claimed he was physically assaulted and sexually threatened during interrogation. He was sent back to the UK in November 2010, and then he disappeared from the radar. Sort of. Because here's the thing, the security services knew about Michael Adebolajo. He'd been investigated, but he wasn't considered a top-level threat. That assessment would prove catastrophic. Michael Adebowale was younger, just 22. Born in May 1992 in Denmark Hill, he also came from a Nigerian Christian family. His mother was a probation officer, his father worked at the Nigerian High Commission. But Michael's life took a darker turn. At 16, he was stabbed in a drug den, an attack that killed an 18-year-old and left Michael traumatized. He converted to Islam around 2009. He dealt drugs, served time, got involved with a gang called the Woolwich Boys. He was troubled, violent, drifting. Experts would later say he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, that he heard voices. He met Adebolajo, and something clicked between them, a shared ideology, a shared rage, a shared belief that British soldiers were legitimate targets because of what Britain was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, on May 22nd, these 2 men left Adebolajo's address in Lewisham at around 1 in the afternoon. They drove a blue Vauxhall Tigra toward Woolwich. The day before, Adebolajo had been caught on CCTV buying a 5-piece knife set and a knife sharpener. They had weapons. They had a plan. And they had a target. Any soldier. It didn't matter who. Lee Rigby just happened to be the one walking down Wellington Street at 1400 hours, 22 May 2013. At 2:18, Lee crossed Artillery Place. Adebolajo pressed the accelerator. The Tigra surged forward, hitting 30 to 40 miles per hour. It struck Lee from behind. The impact threw him into the air. He crashed onto the pavement. The car slammed into a signpost and stopped. Adebolajo and Adebowale got out. They were holding knives, a cleaver, and an old revolver that wasn't even loaded. And then, in broad daylight, on a busy London street, they attacked Lee Rigby's motionless body. They stabbed him repeatedly. Adebolajo tried to decapitate him with the meat cleaver, hacking at his neck with multiple blows. He nearly succeeded. Then, they dragged his body into the middle of the road. And they waited. But here's where this story takes a turn that's both horrifying and extraordinary. Because while most people ran, some people didn't. At 2:21, Ingrid Loyal Kennett, a Cub Scout leader from Cornwall, was riding a number 53 bus through Woolwich. She saw a man lying in the road and assumed there had been a car accident. She got off the bus. She walked toward the body. She knelt down to check for a pulse using her first aid training. There was no pulse. Lee Rigby was dead. And when she looked up, she saw two men standing nearby. One was wearing a black hat. He was holding a cleaver, knives, and a revolver that wasn't even loaded. And then, in broad daylight, on a busy London street, she asked the man with the cleaver and said, "What do you want?" The man, Michael Adebolajo, told her he wanted her to move off the body. Ingrid said, "Why? What happened?" Adebolajo said, "He's a British soldier. I killed him because he killed Muslims. I'm fed up with people killing Muslims in Afghanistan." And then he said something that would become one of the most chilling lines of the entire case. He told Ingrid, "We want to start a war in London tonight." Ingrid looked at him, this man with blood on his hands, with a cleaver in one hand and a revolver in the other, and she said, "Right now, it's only you versus many people. You're going to lose. What would you like to do?" Think about that for a second. A 48-year-old mother facing a man who has just murdered someone in the street, and she's asking him what he wants to do. She's engaging him in conversation. She's keeping him calm. Because she realized something crucial. More and more people were stopping. Mothers with children, other bystanders. And if she could keep these men talking, keep them focused on her, maybe they wouldn't hurt anyone else. So she talked to Adebolajo for 10 minutes. She asked him about his weapons. She asked his accomplice Adebowale to hand over what he was holding. She listened for sirens, waiting for help to arrive. And the entire time, she was terrified. But she didn't show it. She just kept talking.
While Ingrid confronted the killers, two other women, Amanda Donnelly and her daughter Gemini, did something equally brave. They walked up to Lee Rigby's body. They knelt beside him. They prayed. They stroked his hair. They shielded him from further attack, even though the killers were standing right there, even though they'd been warned to stay back. These three women, Ingrid, Amanda, and Gemini, would later be called the Angels of Woolwich. They showed extraordinary courage in the face of evil. And their actions that day, the fact that they refused to abandon Lee even in death, meant that no other bystanders were hurt. Meanwhile, people were filming. In 2013, everyone had a smartphone. Multiple witnesses recorded the aftermath. One video captured Adebolajo speaking directly to the camera. His hands are covered in blood. He's holding a cleaver and knives, and he delivers a chilling statement. He says, "We swear by Almighty Allah, we will never stop fighting you. The only reason we have done this is because Muslims are dying every day. This British soldier is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." He goes on, ranting about British foreign policy, about Muslims being killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's calm. He's articulate. He's performing for the camera. This was part of the plan. The murder wasn't enough. They wanted their message broadcast. They wanted this to be seen. At 2:20, 9 minutes after the attack, unarmed police arrived at the scene. They set up a cordon. They couldn't engage the killers directly because Adebolajo and Adebowale were armed. 5 minutes later, at 2:34, armed officers arrived. In the moment those officers got out of their vehicle, Adebolajo and Adebowale charged. Adebolajo ran toward them wielding the cleaver. Adebowale aimed the revolver at them. The armed officers had no choice. They opened fire. Both men were shot and wounded. Adebolajo was hit multiple times. Adebowale was shot in the thumb. They went down. And just like that, 14 minutes after they murdered Lee Rigby, it was over. The men were arrested, taken to separate hospitals, treated for their wounds, and placed under guard. But the investigation was just beginning, because while everyone now knew who the killers were, the question was why, and more importantly, could this have been prevented? The answer to that question would reveal failures that haunt intelligence services to this day. Michael Adebolajo was no stranger to authorities. After his arrest in Kenya in 2010, trying to join al-Shabaab, he should have been flagged as high risk. But when he returned to the UK, there was a 4-month delay before an investigation was opened. 4 months. During that time, he was free to move, to plan, to radicalize others. When the investigation finally began, it was eventually dropped. Adebolejo was assessed as not being an imminent threat. That assessment was wrong. But here's the thing. Assessing risk is nearly impossible. There were thousands of people on the fringes of extremist groups in the UK. Most will never commit violence. Some will. Figuring out which is which with limited resources is the challenge that keeps intelligence officers up at night. Michael Adebowale was also known to security services. In 2012, he was flagged for concerning behavior. There were plans to put him under surveillance, but there was an 8-month delay. By the time surveillance was being considered in early 2013, it was deemed that Adebowale wasn't an immediate threat either. Again, they were wrong. But retrospective analysis, going back through all the communications between Adebolejo and Adebowale in the weeks before the attack, revealed nothing that would have tipped off investigators. The two men called each other 39 times between April 11th and May 22nd. On May 21st, the day before the murder, they exchanged 16 text messages and made 7 attempted calls. None of that content suggested an imminent attack. They were careful. They kept their plans offline. They knew they were being watched, or could be, so they adapted.
This is the nightmare scenario for counterterrorism. Two men with a history of extremism, both known to authorities, both investigated, both cleared as lower priority. And then they act. Lone wolf terrorism is almost impossible to stop because it requires so few people, so little planning, and can be executed with everyday items – a car, knives from a store. Adebolajo and Adebowale didn't need al-Qaeda to command them. They didn't need sophisticated weapons. They just needed hate. And they had that in abundance. After the attack, 8 people were arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to murder. All were eventually released, either on bail or without charge. The evidence suggested that Adebolajo and Adebowale acted alone, though they were clearly inspired by extremist ideology. Adebolajo had been linked to Anjem Chowdhury, a radical preacher who co-founded Al-Mujahideen. Adebowale had been influenced by online content from Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born cleric who became a key al-Qaeda propagandist before being killed in a U.S. drone strike in 2011. These men hadn't needed direct orders. They'd been radicalized by ideas, by videos, by sermons, by a worldview that told them killing British soldiers was not just acceptable but righteous. On May 31st, Adebolajo was released from hospital and charged with murder, 2 counts of attempted murder of police officers and possession of a firearm. At his court appearance, he asked to be known as Mujahid Aoub Hamza. Adebowale, charged with the same offenses, wanted to be called Ismail ibn Abdullah. They were rejecting their birth names, their British identities, in favor of jihadist personas. On September 27th, both men appeared via video link at the Old Bailey. They pleaded not guilty to all charges. Their trial began on November 29, 2013. During the trial, Adebolajo took the stand. Adebowale did not. Adebolajo's defense was simple. He argued he was a soldier of Allah, obeying God's commands. He said, "I am a soldier. I am a soldier of Allah." He denied murder, claiming he was fighting a war. He said he didn't regret killing Lee Rigby. He said he loved al-Qaeda. He was calm, articulate, and utterly unrepentant. His lawyer described him as intelligent, sincere in his beliefs, and morally convicted. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: CCTV footage of the car hitting Lee, eyewitness testimony from Ingrid Loyal-Kennett, from Amanda and Gemini Donnelly, from other bystanders, the videos filmed at the scene, forensic evidence, the knives, the cleaver, Lee's blood. There was no question that Adebolajo and Adebowale had killed Lee Rigby. The only question was whether the jury would accept that they were soldiers in a war, or murderers
who had butchered an unarmed man.
On December 19, 2013, after 3 weeks of harrowing testimony, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. Both men were convicted of murder. They were also found not guilty of attempted murder of a police officer, a verdict that took 90 minutes to reach. When the verdict was read, Adebolajo and Adebowale remained calm. But 2 months later, when it came time for sentencing, their composure shattered. On February 26, 2014, Mr. Justice Sweeney began his sentencing remarks. He said the men had butchered Lee Rigby. He said their actions were a betrayal of Islam. At those words, Adebowale shouted, "That's a lie." Adebolajo joined in, screaming, "Allahu Akbar." They struggled with security guards, fighting, yelling, until they were physically dragged from the dock. The judge sentenced them in their absence. Michael Adebolajo received a whole life term. He would die in prison. Michael Adebowale, younger at 22, was given a minimum term of 45 years. He would be nearly 70 before even being considered for parole. But the story doesn't end there, because while justice was served, the damage had been done. Lee Rigby was dead. His son Jack was growing up without a father. His mother, Lynn, his wife, Rebecca, his sisters, his stepfather, Ian, all of them were left with a hole that could never be filled. On July 12, 2013, Lee was given a military funeral at Bury Parish Church in Greater Manchester. Thousands attended, including Prime Minister David Cameron and Mayor of London Boris Johnson. Rebecca walked in carrying Jack, just 2 years old, wearing his "My Daddy, My Hero" shirt. The nation mourned with them. Lee was buried at Middleton Cemetery. Memorials were erected. His name was added to the Armed Forces Memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum. But none of it brought him back. And then there's the legacy of the attack itself. In the days following Lee's murder, tensions spiked. The English Defence League called for protests. Far-right groups tried to exploit the attack to stir anti-Muslim sentiment. There were demonstrations in Woolwich, bottles thrown at police, arrests made. A 21-year-old woman was ordered to complete 250 hours of unpaid work after tweeting that people in "Help for Heroes" t-shirts deserved to be beheaded. The case had ignited something ugly, a culture war, a blame game, Muslims versus the rest, immigrants versus natives. It was exactly what Adebolajo and Adebowale wanted. They wanted division, they wanted fear, and for a while, it looked like they might get it. But something else happened too. The image of Ingrid Loyal Kennett standing her ground, talking calmly to a man with blood on his hands, became a symbol of defiance. Prime Minister Cameron mentioned her in his statement, saying, "When told by the attacker that he wanted to start a war in London, she replied, 'You're going to lose. It's only you versus many.' She spoke for us all." And she did. Because in that moment, Ingrid embodied something fundamental: the refusal to be terrorized, the refusal to let evil win. The angels of Woolwich, Ingrid, Amanda, and Gemini, showed that ordinary people, when faced with the worst humanity has to offer, can choose courage. A parliamentary inquiry was launched. On November 25, 2014, the findings were published. The Intelligence and Security Committee reviewed the actions of MI5, the Secret Intelligence Service, and GCHQ. They found delays. They found missed opportunities. The 4-month delay in investigating Adebolajo after his return from Kenya. The 8-month delay in investigating Adebowale. But the committee concluded that even with hindsight, it was improbable that any level of surveillance would have revealed enough to prevent the attack. Adebolajo and Adebowale were security conscious. They communicated carefully. They planned in person. They left no digital trail that would have alerted authorities. The sad truth is that some attacks are nearly impossible to stop.
Prime Minister Cameron established a task force to tackle radicalization. He called for dismantling the conveyor belt to radicalization in schools, colleges, universities, online, and in prisons. New policies were introduced. The PREVENT program was expanded, designed to identify and intervene with individuals at risk of radicalization. Debates raged about free speech, about surveillance, about the balance between security and liberty. Some argued for more aggressive monitoring of extremist groups. Others warned against overreach, against creating a police state. There were no easy answers. There still aren't. Today, Michael Adebolajo remains in prison, serving a whole life term. He'll never be released. Reports from inside indicate he remains unrepentant, still clinging to his extremist beliefs. Michael Adebowale is at Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital. In January 2021, he contracted COVID-19 and was hospitalized, then returned to Broadmoor. He won't be eligible for parole until he's in his 60s. Both men have effectively been erased from society, locked away where they can't harm anyone else. But their crime lives on in the collective memory. And then there's Jack Rigby, that 2-year-old boy at his father's funeral. He's a teenager now. On the 10th anniversary of Lee's murder, in May 2023, Jack did something remarkable. He set out to raise £10,000 for Scotty's Little Soldiers, a charity for bereaved military children. He walked 26.2 miles, a full marathon, throughout May. His mother, Rebecca, walked with him. And the public responded. Jack raised over £54,000. By 2023, that total had exceeded £100,000. At the Pride of Britain Awards, Jack received the Good Morning Britain Young Fundraiser of the Year award. Rebecca said, "Jack wants to show how even though he's grown up without Lee, he's not forgotten his dad, and he will always be part of his life. Just because Jack was young, it doesn't mean he's forgotten Lee." Jack himself said, "Scotty's makes me feel proud. It helps to know I'm not the only one in my situation, and that there's people I can reach out and talk to whenever I need them." That's the real legacy. Not the killers rotting in prison, not the debates about surveillance or radicalization, but a boy turning his grief into something good, honoring his father by helping other children who've lost parents in service. Lee Rigby would be 37 years old today. He'd be watching his son grow up, teaching him to play football, taking him to Manchester United matches. Instead, there's a gravestone, a memorial, photos and memories, and a teenager doing his best to keep his father's name alive.
So what can we learn from this case? What does it teach us about terrorism, about security, about humanity? First, it teaches us that radicalization is a process, not an event. Adebolajo and Adebowale didn't wake up one day and decide to kill a soldier. They were gradually pulled into an ideology that dehumanized their victims, that justified murder as religious duty. They were exposed to extremist preachers, to online propaganda, to a community that reinforced their beliefs. Breaking that cycle requires intervention at multiple points, in families, schools, communities, online platforms. It requires addressing grievances, offering alternatives, providing pathways out. But it also requires recognizing that some people, despite every intervention, will choose violence. Second, it teaches us about the limits of intelligence work. We want to believe that security services can stop every attack, that with enough surveillance, enough data, enough resources, we can predict and prevent violence. But the reality is messier. There are too many people on watch lists, too few resources to monitor them all, and too many ways for determined individuals to evade detection. Adebolajo and Adebowale were both known, both investigated, both assessed as lower risk.
and both killed. The system didn't fail because people weren't doing their jobs. It failed because the task is nearly impossible. How do you identify among thousands of angry young men exposed to extremist ideas the handful who will actually act? There's no algorithm for that. Only judgment calls made by exhausted analysts with incomplete information. Third, it teaches us that evil is real, and it can look like anyone. Michael Adebolajo attended university. Michael Adebowale's mother was a probation officer. They weren't monsters from a distant land. They were British, raised here, educated here. They had families, friends, normal lives. And then they chose to run down a stranger with a car and hack him to death in the street. Not because Lee Rigby had personally wronged them, not because he posed any threat, but because he wore a uniform that to them represented an enemy. That level of dehumanization, that ability to see another person not as a human being, but as a symbol to be destroyed, that's what makes terrorism so horrifying. It strips away the fundamental recognition that we're all human. And once that's gone, anything becomes possible. But fourth, and perhaps most important, it teaches us about courage. About Ingrid Loyal Kennett getting off a bus and walking toward danger. About Amanda and Gemini Donnelly kneeling beside a murdered man and refusing to leave him alone. About ordinary people faced with extraordinary evil, choosing to act with compassion and bravery. Ingrid said later that she wasn't a hero, that she just did what anyone would do. But that's not true. Most people ran. She stayed. And in staying, in engaging with those killers, in keeping them talking until help arrived, she saved lives. That's heroism. Not the Hollywood version, but the real kind. The kind that happens when fear says run and something deeper says stay. The Woolwich attack was a tragedy. A young father murdered, a family shattered, a nation forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the enemies within. But it was also a story of resilience, of communities coming together, of individuals standing up, of a little boy turning his pain into purpose. Lee Rigby's death was senseless, but his life mattered. And the way his family, his friends, his community have honored that life, that's what endures. So I want to know what you think. Could this attack have been prevented? Do you think the intelligence services failed, or were they working with impossible constraints? And what would you have done if you'd been on that street, if you'd seen what Ingrid saw? Would you have stayed, or would you have run? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and the most insightful comment gets pinned. If this investigation showed you something you didn't know, if it made you think differently about terrorism, radicalization, courage, then subscribe. Because next week, I'm covering a case that's even more complex. A killer who hid in plain sight for over a decade. A detective who became obsessed with finding the truth. And a piece of evidence that changed everything. It's a story about obsession, about justice, and about what happens when the system gives up, but one person refuses to. That video drops next week. Don't miss it. And if you want to dive deeper into another case of domestic terrorism and the failures that enabled it, watch my video on the link on your screen right now. It's about a bombing that could have been stopped and the warning signs that everyone ignored. I'll see you there. Thank you for watching. Remember Lee Rigby. Remember his son Jack. Remember the angels of Woolwich. And remember that in the face of evil, courage is always a choice. Some people choose to run, some choose to stay. The ones who stay, they're the ones who remind us what it means to be human.